week 8 of the fantasy football season. Here's a few kickers I looked at on the wire this week. The first guy is Austin Siebert of the Detroit Lions. So Siebert has been pretty decent so far this season, the last couple games here. Week 5 in Minnesota, 12 fantasy points. Week 6 versus Cincinnati, 3 fantasy points. And Week 7 at the Rams, 15 fantasy points. So right here, he's had good 30 points in his last 3 fantasy days here, is Siebert. And Week 8, he's got a good matchup versus the Philadelphia Eagles that give up a lot of points. A lot of teams are in the red zone versus them. And I think he could have a good ball game in a mini shootout as well, in my opinion, is Siebert. So right now, he's universally available in 100% of fantasy leagues. And this Lion team's a team that don't punch the ball into the end zone a lot. So I think in this game versus Philly, he could have a decent amount of opportunities. And he's definitely worth an ad, in my opinion, is Austin Siebert with a good matchup and on a team that plays indoors as well. The next kick is Gano of the New York Giants. Gano, he's an every week type of kicker, it seems like, this season. But when he has those double-digit games, it's been big games. So right here, Gano, a 15-point fantasy day in Week 7 for him versus Carolina. So right here, this Giant team, they got a matchup at the Kansas City Chiefs. And we've seen this season the Chiefs do give up a lot of points. But obviously this Giant offense ain't as explosive as the offenses the Chiefs have versus this season. Like a Baltimore, obviously like Tennessee that went up and down the field on them in Week 7, but I think Gano is a decent option. He's a guy that gets at least 2 or 3 attempts each and every game as well, it seems like. And he's available in 85% of fantasy leagues, so I would give him an ad at the kicking position this week. The next kick is Randy Bullock of the Tennessee Titans. So I mentioned Bullock as an ad last week, and he didn't disappoint. If you got him on your fantasy team this week, he had 11 fantasy points in Week 7. He was added in 16% of fantasy leagues, but he's still available right now, is Randy Bullock. Still in 82% of fantasy leagues, and he's on one of the better offenses in football. Tennessee, they're starting to get things together now. Julio Jones is getting healthier slower. A.J. Brown, he's looked great the last 2 games since he returned from his injuries. And right here, Week 8 in Indianapolis, Randy Bullock, it's an indoor game, division matchup. I think he's going to get a few opportunities and continue the streak of double-digit fantasy points as well is a possibility. The next kicker I look to get is Greg Joseph of the Minnesota Vikings. So Greg Joseph, I've mentioned him as a waiver wire ad a lot this season, but now he's been back on the wire a lot after the Minnesota Vikings had the bye week in Week 7. He's been dropped in 15% of fantasy leagues, and he's available in a whopping 93% of fantasy leagues now. But Greg Joseph, he's had a good year in his first year in Minnesota with 3 double-digit fantasy games in the first 6. And he's pretty much a guy you could pencil in anywhere from 8 to 10 fantasy points each and every week. And in Week 8, he's got a good matchup versus the Dallas Cowboys, where this game's going to be a monster shootout between the Vikings and the Cowboys, in my opinion, in Minnesota on Sunday Night Football. So right here, Greg Joseph, he's definitely a player I would recommend as an ad. And he's a kicker, like I mentioned, that's been one of the better kickers in fantasy football this season. And the 5th and final kicker I look to get on the wire this week, McPherson of the Cincinnati Bengals. So McPherson, I've mentioned him a few times this season, and he's had a great season as well in his rookie year here, is McPherson. So the last 2 fantasy games for him, Week 6 at Detroit, 11 fantasy points. And Week 7 in Baltimore, a great ball game, 13 fantasy points. And now in Week 8, he's got an amazing matchup at the New York Jets that give up the 2nd most fantasy points to kickers. So right here, McPherson, I think once again for the 3rd week in a row, in Week 8, he will get double-digit fantasy points. And he's available in tons of fantasy leagues and 93% of leagues. So that's a few kickers I looked at on the waiver wire for Week 8 of the fantasy football season.